Hi, thank you for joining. I'm your moderator, Tamara Tolles O'Loughlin, and I'm the North America Director at 350.org. Gonna have that problem all day, I see. First, I will ask you, we're gonna start a conversation about the emerging concept of climate reparations. But first, I'm going to ask you to imagine that we're in 2030, where we'll begin the implementation of hard-won reimagining of our infrastructure, from the design of our cities to the transportation of goods, including climate neutral housing and the retooling of agriculture. We will have reshaped the design of the job market and access to education that enables it, following the rattle of pandemic in every part of the world. Our centralized systems of distribution and energy production will have no choice but to follow. We will have seen a major shift in the distribution of everything, from our global governance, away from national identity stemming from movements for economic accountability, as resources move from the global north to the global south, even within nation states. The real question is, how are we going to pay for it? All of this will be brought about by multi-generational leadership and material struggles for a Green New Deal and resounding demand for planetary care and repair. Climate reparations will end financial violence shielded by racism as a narrow, extractive, and destructive concept. It is my pleasure to introduce you to some of the foremost thinkers and campaigners on reparations, land back, indigenous sovereignty, and care and repair strategies at the global level. Our panel today includes Professor Maxine Burkett, Professor of Law at the William S. Richardson School of Law, University of Hawaii. Dr. Sandy Darity, Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics at Duke University. Our conversation will feature the work of Dr. Sonia Klinsky, Associate Professor of Sustainability at Arizona State University, who's unable to join us today. And Ruth Miller, Climate Campaigner at Native Movement. It is an honor to jump into a conversation with you today, but since we're gonna talk about such heavy subject matter, I thought it'd only be fair to go through a few brief slides on climate reparations so that we could spend the bulk of the time hearing from our panel before we conclude with the audience Q&A. So just because we're in a real creative space, I wanna make sure we are starting with the same assumptions about the world. The most important being that no community group or people should bear an outsized burden of environmental threats, ecological manipulation, or be excluded from decisions that determine their future, and certainly not for profit. So our assumption is that poverty is not biological, but a function of design, which begs the question, if our problems are a matter of design, shouldn't our response be redesign? So let's talk a little bit about the types of reparations there are. There are quite a few. When it comes to reparations, we are recognizing that we intend to provide benefits to those who've been harmed and demonstrate a regime's forward orientation towards harm exclusion, mitigation, the end of that activity. As we launch further into the conversation today, we're gonna talk to Dr. Sandy Darity. I'm a little nervous because he's right here. Just to talk about the road to reparations and his 3-point considerations of what has to be there before we know we've had it. First, you have to acknowledge that you've done something wrong. Then you have to offer restitution, and then you have to close out your activity. Next, he'll dig into what this means in great detail, and we'll have a conversation that involves Ruth jumping in to talk to us about reparations for Indigenous communities, why it is incredibly important that we do not pretend the conversation around reparations is separate from the concept of land back, and how that shows up in global conversations around the world as loss and damage and other pieces of really important and critical thinking from all around the world. Finally, we are going to hear from Maxine Burkett, who wrote the words down. It came to her, like Michael Jackson, before it was creepy, or Prince, who was always creepy, but we were with it. She is the person who birthed this concept in writing, who started to think about it, who has pushed it through to this place where we're all digging in to figure out how do we make it real. She's gonna be super shy about it, so I figured I would not be. Welcome, Maxine. We'll talk a little bit about why now is the moment. Climate reparations is here now. It is time for us to unearth what we have done, the harms of the system, structural design, and it's time to launch a redesign that really seeks to improve the life of people who've been hurt. This moment looks at our collective problems and sets up our opportunity for collective healing. There aren't any other ideas out there that build in the concept of trauma-informed response. It's really trendy to say, but who's putting it into policy? So when we ask the question, is climate reparations for you? Is climate reparations for everyone? The answer is yes. Because if you cause the harm, you need truth and reconciliation to get to the next place. And if you hurt people, you need money, you need resources, you need support, and you need people to stop harming you to get there. So in terms of thinking through what it looks like, Sonia Klinsky really has given so much thought to these different levels of thinking about what climate reparations could look like. If we aren't restoring people, then we aren't really sorry. If we're not compensating them from their harm, how can they move on? If we're not offering rehabilitation, we're assuming that just by getting what's owed to you, you will cease to be an injured party. Satisfaction. That means it has to come from the perspective of those who are harmed, not the people who are giving it out. And guarantees of non-repetition. All of this is being discussed at length in the UN, in the COP, in places where the world is coming together to talk about loss and damage in this bigger context. So just to flag another one of our esteemed advisory board members who's not on this panel today, Nick Estes, he really summed up that this work is a lot about undoing what's been done to the indigenous Americas and Africa. This is a place where we have to talk about being more than just saying we're Black, Indigenous, and people of color struggling together, but build out a framework for what it looks like to get what's ours. So in flagging a really exciting panel that I'm ready to get into, I want us all to know that we are in this moment of global pandemic. So much of what we're hoping to be over by 2030, we are experiencing at a more rapid rate than we could have imagined. And it's time to make those folks pay. So with no further ado, I'd like to get into this conversation with our panelists today and open up this room to a deeper conversation. Please come off mic, esteemed panelists. I'm going to just jump right in to a really, shallow question relative to what we're talking about. Can you talk to us about the relationship between climate reparations and Black and African-American struggles for reparations, Dr. Darity? And Maxine, it'd be super great, Dr. Burkett, if you could jump in as well, but I think it feels like it would be odd not to start this conversation around Black reparations and really digging in for folks who are new to all of this.
Let me start with one of the items that you posted on the slide, ARC, acknowledgement, redress, and closure. And in fact, in our book that's represented on the slide here, Kirsten Mullen and I argue that a good definition of reparations is a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. And that's a general definition that we don't think is necessarily specific to reparations for Black American descendants of US slavery. But our book is devoted primarily to that topic. And by acknowledgement, we mean that the culpable party admits two things. First, that it has committed a wrong, and also that it has benefited from committing that wrong. Redress is the culpable party taking steps to try to compensate for that wrong, or steps that we would also describe as acts of restitution. Usually this involves monetary payment, and other examples or instances of reparations. And then the third component is closure, where the culpable party and the victimized community come to an agreement or a consensus that the bill has been paid. So when we talk about climate reparations, we have a host of complexities that don't necessarily arise if we're thinking about other types of reparations involving harms that have been done to very specific and identifiable communities. So for example, if we think about German reparations payments to victims of the Holocaust, it's very clear that the German government was the culpable party, and it's very clear who the victims were during the course of the Holocaust, largely or overwhelmingly members of the Jewish population throughout much of Europe, but also the Roma and other communities that were victimized, that were deemed dispensable on the part of the Nazis. In the case of Japanese American reparations, where reparations payments, monetary payments, were made to Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during the course of World War II, those payments were made by the United States government, and they were directed at the community that had been explicitly victimized, individuals who had been incarcerated unfairly or unjustly during the course of World War II. If we think about reparations for Black American descendants of US slavery, the culpable party is once again plainly the United States government, and the victimized community can be well defined as the folks who are descendants of persons who were denied the restitution of 40 acres in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. But with climate change, then it becomes much harder to talk about who the victims and the culpable party are. In a sense, we could argue that the victim is the entire planet, but clearly there are some communities that have borne a much more severe burden than others in the process of undermining our traditional climate cycle. The culpable parties could include national governments, who are responsible for the absence of carbon emission constraints. They could be corporations who are responsible directly for the carbon emissions, or it could be airplane and auto travelers who utilize vehicles that are high carbon emitters. So there's a very complicated issue here. We think in our book about the importance of a quotation from Malcolm X, where he talks about an analogy with an instance in which an individual has had a knife plunged into their back, and the person who has executed this atrocity finally begins to pull the knife out. And Malcolm X says, well, you could pull it all the way out, but that would not be the equivalent of healing the wound. And so we like to distinguish between steps that end the harms or prevent the harms from continuing or on an ongoing basis versus steps that are taken to compensate for the effects of the harm. And it is the latter that we think of as reparations. One of the problems, of course, is if the knife has been plunged in and the victim has died, then it's very difficult to provide either the opportunity to pull the knife out in a useful way or to provide compensation. And so we have to raise the question now whether or not our planet has already died, or do we have an opportunity to not only pull the knife out, but compensate those communities who have been most severely affected. In the context of Black American reparations, as we see it, pulling the knife out is the equivalent of stopping anti-Black police violence, or stopping stopping the process of not providing services to disproportionately Black communities, or stopping discrimination in employment, housing, and credit markets. But stopping the harm is not the equivalent of compensating for the harm. And compensation for the harm, from our perspective, requires addressing the enormous racial wealth disparity that exists in the United States. That provides a metric for evaluating how effective reparations might be for Black American descendants of US slavery. But what's the complicated metric that we might use to address the question of the impact or effectiveness of reparations for climate change. These are some really terrifically hard questions, and I'm thrilled that Maxime Burkett and Sonia Klinsky have been thinking deeply about these hard questions.
We are heartily joining you and being grateful for that. Professor Burkett, can you talk to us a little bit about how we move from this larger concept of Black reparations into the climate reparations framework, and really answer the question, why should reparations matter to climate people?
Yeah, that's a great question, and Sandy, you've raised some of the interesting issues that come out of this question of how to apply reparations to climate change and some of the complexity of it. And I just want to offer, for those who are maybe concerned about the ability for this to even be actionable, that what is terrifically hard, to use the appropriate term, is addressing climate change, is dealing with the impacts of climate change, right? I think if you're at this panel, you probably know that you can't overstate just the gravity of the climate situation right now, that is an increase in the change and an increase in the rate of change. So we're going to be seeing what we're seeing now at such great speed and ferocity that the alternatives, as difficult as they may be, are actually far better than not dealing with the issues of climate change. And we know that they are, those grave impacts are disproportionately borne by communities of color, and if it's in the United States and globally. So when we think about the difference in experience of climate change and whose back the knife has been plunged into, it's actually not even the planet. The planet will be fine. It is the millions and billions of Black and brown people who have been historically subject to this kind of sort of byproduct of the carbon economy. Now, why does this matter? First of all, reparations is a really it's a relatively common feature of international law. I think a lot about the law. It's an incredibly important process for repairing relationships, as the quotation that was shared earlier demonstrated. What we know now, why reparations should matter to climate people, is because we can't understand the full cause or consequence of the climate crisis without understanding that the suffering has been disproportionate, that the indirect violence and trauma of overconsumption and unjust enrichment by, I think, very identifiable perpetrators like wealthy countries in the global north, including the United States, wealthy multinational corporations and fossil fuel industries headquartered and incorporated in the United States. All of the benefits have been borne by a privileged few, and the outcomes and the prognoses are grave for Black people, for Indigenous people, for people of color in this country. And it's fractal-like, so that pattern actually extends out to the experience in the global community, the global north and south. We see those differences. A privileged few have benefited from the intensive carbon economy, while a much larger and depleted set of economies and people within them have been treated as disposable. So there's a resolution to ensure that all of us survive and ideally thrive. If we are resolved around that, it requires massive transfers of resources to reduce emissions dramatically and to support adaptive capacity to the extent that we are able to reduce emissions and have an opportunity to adapt. So that's a bit of the moral case, which is to say that there are many of us that are suffering and have not had the input into the harm itself, have actually been subject to that harm, certainly over the last several decades and over the last centuries with the same ideology. At the time of sort of thinking about climate reparations, writing the article about it, climate had, and I think to some extent has continued to be mired in sort of the politics and economics and cost benefit analyses, the discussions of just sort of putting up hard infrastructure and swapping out certain infrastructure. And what we have been missing in this more clinical and amoral discussion is actually what it means to live in this circumstance where your environment, where you live, work, and play, has been so thoroughly compromised that your livelihood is so depleted that you would actually consider, leaving your home, marching thousands of miles to seek refuge in a country in which you've labeled you a criminal before you've even made the attempts, in which children have been labeled as criminals. And here I'm speaking to the migrant caravans, so-called, that have obviously a climate fingerprint and the need to move. But in addition to the moral case, I just want to say that there's also a strategic benefit, which is to say that in order to properly solve a problem, you have to diagnose it. And in order to repair it and not repeat the initiating harm, which is now decades and centuries old, you have to understand the degree to which the carbon economy is interrelated with racism. The carbon economy has required sacrifice zones. Sacrifice zones require racism. The causes and widespread impacts of that should be appreciated by anyone who calls themselves a climate person, which I would argue is an interesting paradoxical term, because if you are a person, you are in the climate, you must be concerned. And frankly, so many climate people are of color, are Black, are Indigenous, and we just haven't been seen as those people. So eliminating that underlying dynamic, the phenomenon remediating will yield benefits for all of us, but it also is important because reparations are meant to right wrongs and to forge right relationships between parties and people. And as a practical matter, the relationship within our country and across movements needs to be repaired to build trust and solidarity in the face of this really mounting challenge that we face. So the question isn't, can we, what is climate reparations? Should it matter to climate people? Is it too difficult? Is adequate climate action even possible without collective action? And if not, can collective action of this scale emerge within current relationships? If not, what do we need to do to repair those relationships? I think that's critically important for us to consider when trying to understand and unravel this climate reparation conundrum. I think we're going to talk more about this in a little bit, but I just want to suggest that it is not as difficult as we think to understand who the victims or creditors are, who the perpetrators or debtors are, and who is primarily responsible. Yes, we all engage in the carbon economy because we don't have a choice, but we all wanted power to facilitate our lives. We did not ask for fossil fuels. And that's an incredible distinction, because as long as I've been alive, there's been an alternative. And that's 43 years behind that we are at this moment. I'll stop there.
I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm in church. Won't she do it? Just wanna say it. All of that was so very necessary to help lay the foundation for this conversation. Ruth, can I ask you to jump in and talk to us about who pays and why they pay, and how your life as an activist helps us understand that?
Yahlidu, everybody. Shibak isen shiiji Ruth Miller Gustana shiiji. Adena inakanega shalkun kanash chariangas nanish ite. Eko kasnan shugu shakai kilanda dege kak shugu yastuda. Chikanekali kiriki. Thank you, everyone, for giving us this space and joining this discussion with us. I am just in awe, and I feel like I can't take notes fast enough. I feel like I'm getting like a free lecture series, but I'll do the best that I can to represent myself and my community here today in this conversation. My English name is Ruth Miller. I'm a Dena'ina Athabascan and an Ashkenazi Jewish woman born and raised on my traditional homelands here in Degeyekak, otherwise known as Anchorage, Alaska. My name in Dena'ina is Shivaik Isen, which means whirlwind woman. And I am a climate justice organizer for an Indigenous-led, matriarchal, really dope grassroots organization called Native Movement, which takes on forefront battles in narrative building and in environmental justice, as well as in Indigenous rights and gender justice across Alaska and the nation. Now, when we talk about climate reparations, I'll admit this isn't a language that's common, because for us, we call climate reparations healing. It's part of healing. When we think about climate justice, we're thinking about being in right relationship with the land. When we think about the language of just transition, here at home, we use the words kotr'elne, which means remembering forward in Benti Kanaga, one of the languages from the interior of Alaska. Because our Indigenous communities, our Indigenous cultures were grown from and with this land over millennia in right relationship with it, we as a people, we as language bearers, we as culture bearers live just transition. We live right relationship with the land. That disruption happens when our lands are seized, when our lands are exploited, when we are preyed upon for the purposes of upholding an extractive regime of systemic racism that is solely predicated on Indigenous genocide. The United States was founded on the forced labor of Black and African descendant bodies and on the erasure of Indigenous peoples. And so if we are going to address the circumstances that we find ourselves in now as a global environment, particularly on the forefront of climate repercussions here in the Arctic, we have to think about the processes and the systems that got us here and that are fundamentally predicated on our exploitation, which means that climate justice cannot be achieved without social justice. It means that environmental repair cannot be achieved without a real face-to-face with what reparations must mean for all of our harmed communities. So when we think about what returning to right relationship with the land is, not just healing climate, we often use the language of land back, which means plain and simple, giving land back to the Indigenous communities from whom it was taken. Our languages, our traditions, the way that we live our lives, the way we move with the seasons, every bit of it was grown, was learned from the lands that we live on. We here in the North still live in deep relationship with the seasons. When we think of, food, we don't think of a grocery store. We think of the river systems. We think of the beach. We think of the caribou and the tundra. We think of the animal relatives and plant relatives that we live with and live for, which also means that when we think of, our future, we're now forced to think of our melting ice caps, our melting permafrost, how our villages like Kivalina are falling into the ocean, eroding in ways that they haven't for the millennia that this land has been loved by Indigenous communities. We think of the toxins in our waters and our airs that are poisoning our fish. We're thinking of our fish dying by the thousands in dried up streams, having heat stroke before they have a chance to reproduce. I went out fishing 3 times for my family this summer and came back with 4 salmon, 4 hlika. No one knew where they had gone. So when we think of the repercussions of climate change, we feel it in our stomachs, we feel it in our hungry bellies. We think about the ways that we can't continue our traditional practices that have survived for millennia, that have survived for thousands of years, taught by grandmothers to grandchildren, that are now suddenly, because of this ecological imbalance and because of the predatory for-profit systems that benefit a few, will melt away, will be taken from us, will be lost. So climate reparations for Indigenous communities is not just, it's not just a moral argument. It is the only pathway towards healing for our planet, because the cultural values that Indigenous communities hold, the Indigenous knowledge systems that are place-based and specific to location, are the best forms of science we have to know lands and waters, to know what is good for the earth. But additionally, because the genocide of Indigenous peoples was so predicated on assimilation and cultural genocide, we also have to remember that pathways towards climate justice include healing for all of us, that these lessons are a fundamental part of the healing work that we all must do as a global community. And as Dr. Darity shared with us, that has to begin with acknowledgement. That has to begin with a righting of the wrongs. We have to understand how there is no pathway towards justice when the fossil fuel economy is still profiteering off of Indigenous lands and Black and brown bodies. There is no climate justice if all of our solutions are akin to that predatory behavior, that occupy and exploit Indigenous lands farther, that continue to make sacrifice zones and put already vulnerable communities further in peril. So we have to really critically think about the fundamental way that we will spiritually approach our climate justice. What type of world are we willing to enact? It's not enough to pull out that knife. You've got to stop twisting it, for one. And then you have to deeply invest in what healing looks like. And then I think additionally, you know, commit to a long-term relationship of talking about that pain that was caused, you know, using trauma-informed response into policy, thinking about the generational trauma that my family now carries, that my community now carries from assimilation tactics that were meant to kill the Indian and save the man. You know, all of that is deeply entwined with climate justice because we are deeply entwined with the sustainability of our lands and waters, each of us. But what Indigenous stewardship has to offer the global community, what Indigenous solidarity with Black liberation has to offer, is a pathway towards collective healing, a pathway towards building and deeply investing and prioritizing in that right relationship, not just with one another, but with our Mother Earth. And I guess I'll stop there because I'm really excited to hear more from everyone else.
Incredible start. So one thing that's been a thread across all of your statements about the work, where it's going, what you're seeing, the history, is that there's a reticence. People are nervous. It feels too big. But each of you has also presented that going forward in this manner is the only thing we can do if we're going to come to a resolution. So can I ask each of you to talk a little bit about what you think it'll take to get climate reparations in the US and what happens next? That's a big question. So whoever would like to go first.
I'll go first, but I want to circle into that in a slightly different way because I'm really appreciative of Ruth's comment about land back and the significance of the relationship between communities, culture, and the land. One could argue that climate change is essentially having a genocidal effect on communities that are touched intensely by the effects of the warming of our planet. You know, I'm thinking that one of the issues that's being raised by Ruth and her community is the question of whether or not they can maintain their cultural traditions as the world environment changes so quickly around them, so quickly that they don't really have an opportunity to make a decision about whether or not they want to change their ways. They are compelled to change their ways because there's no alternative. And so I think we need to bring the term genocide into the conversation, because I think that the destruction of the cultural life of a community is a form of genocide. The second thing I want to say in the context of land back is the centrality of land to the very case that I've been working on so intensively for Black American reparations. As you may well know, when General Sherman reached the Georgia coast at the end of his troops' march through the state of Georgia in 1865, in January of that year, he met with a group of Black leaders, primarily ministers, who had selected as their spokesperson a gentleman named Garrison Frazier, who is from my home state of North Carolina. And General Sherman and Secretary of War Stanton asked these leaders what it was they wanted to see happen on behalf of the formerly enslaved. And Garrison Frazier, speaking on their behalf, said they wanted land to till and they wanted to be left alone. Unfortunately, neither actually happened. About 40,000 of the formerly enslaved were settled on 400,000 acres out of the full allotment of 5.3 million acres that Sherman's Special Orders number 15 designated. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor after Lincoln was murdered, reversed the project altogether. And so that the net effect was the formerly enslaved received no restitution, but the primary thing that they were seeking in the aftermath of the Civil War was access to land. At the same time, the United States inaugurated the Homestead Acts, which created allotments of 160 acres for a large, large number of white American families, upwards of about 1.5 million. And the benefits of those land allotments, those 160-acre land allotments, still redound to approximately 45 to 50 million living white Americans across the generations. So we have images of the romance of the wagon train moving westward. But essentially what the wagon train was doing, it was carrying a process of settler colonialism, because the land that was allotted under the 160 acres program was land that had been taken from the indigenous people. We have false images of heroism that apply to both sides of the ledger. The false images of the heroism of the Confederacy on one side of the ledger, the false heroism of the Western settlers on the other side of the ledger. So I think that there's a real centrality to land in this conversation, but one of the things we need to resolve is how we can restore the land to its proper uses and proper status, but also if we can't do that in its entirety, can we compensate people in some other way for the damage or destruction to their opportunities for maintaining access to the land?
Thank you, Sandy. That was an incredible response. Let's see who's going to follow that. What will it take to win climate reparations in the U.S. and what happens next?
Yeah, I might chime in and just sort of speak specifically to this question around, how do we wrestle the big issue of, who is the subject of this? Like, who are we directing the reparations toward? I just want to sort of underscore along the lines of the sort of historical perspective that Dr. Darity's provided, that there are similar sort of stories around expropriation and stories of conquest, right? That leave out the trauma and dispossession, and again, the sense of, certain people are disposable, certain places are easily sacrificed without consequence, and actually in the name of progress. And so what I think is really critically important is that we have, through the climate litigation that's been propping up, looking at, in particular, the cases between the young people in the U.S. against the U.S. government, and then also the cases at the state and local level against the fossil fuel companies. We have seen, and excellent investigative reporting, we have actually been able to find the sort of smoking gun in terms of the documents that demonstrate that all of these companies knew what they were doing, knew with just sort of eerie precision how many parts per million we'd be at by 2020, how many people would be compromised, the degree of food insecurity that would be sort of globally experienced. All of these intense storms, like sort of the notion that a 500-year storm in Houston is sort of is laughable, because the time scales no longer mean anything because they're experiencing them in rapid succession. And and 500, and the use of 500 years is so profound because that's the sort of the opening chapter of the colonial experience. I mean, what we're seeing right now is that we have a clear set of entities, the fossil fuel companies and the U.S. government's, in some cases, partnership and collusion with the fossil fuel companies to perpetuate this this particular economy. And my key sense is that, I think a lot about the academic elements of it, the theory, the background, the history, but I also want to make it easier for people to understand that in their lifetimes, there were opportunities for this present, the future of the 70s, right? This present day to have looked vastly different than it does right now. I would love to see billboards quoting Shell and Royal Dutch Shell, or quoting ExxonMobil, excerpting their documents, which, they were fully aware of. It wasn't just sort of fringe scientists saying that this is happening and no one was listening. They have shored up their offshore drilling platforms and raised them into anticipation of sea level rise. This is not something that wasn't deeply insidious and at least a knowing recklessness. And if people understood the fact that we did not have to have this particular future where we're literally as mothers, as aunties, as cousins, as daughters, contemplating generations of imposed hardship and chaos. And again, that's going to be disproportionately experienced by those who have been experiencing this kind of sense of being disposable and sacrificed over the last many generations. So as a practical matter, how do we win reparations? I think we need to make it very clear that there has been an offending harm and that we are living that harm and that there was an alternative, and we did not have to be sort of, again, contemplating this kind of work in a moment when what becomes, again, terrifically hard is approaching this rapidly changing climate without trust and solidarity and equity between communities. And so there's a practical information campaign here that will unravel the disinformation campaign that's led us to believe that this was the only future that we would know and experience.
Thank you so much. And I just want to lift up a couple of things that you dropped in that last few sentences there. You were talking about Juliana versus the United States as one of the cases that has moved forward to capture the sense of climate liability. There are a whole suite of climate liability cases, and there will be more. The question is, will we get a government that enables the legislation so that those dollars go to the people that need them through a Green New Deal and through other vehicles? It's really important to lift up the fact that we're not waiting for something to come. It is here. Your point around lifting up the fact that if a company can shield itself from losing its business, then they know how much it costs them to stop doing it. So I just want to, I really thought that was a thing that you slipped past there, and I didn't want that to fly past folks.
I know, I just really quickly, I just wanted to say,
Yeah,
in terms of those cases, those are profoundly important cases, and there are gaps in litigation. As much as I teach it, I believe in it, but there are the comprehensiveness of climate reparations makes it so critically important to be able to hold space for all of the traumas that we're trying to at least make more right, because the full repair we'll never see in our lifetimes. The other piece is that when you think about these companies having, made sure that their own facilities were in better shape. This is exactly why reparations, in that the focus on guarantees of non-repetition, is exactly what we need as a lens, because when you think about BP announcing that it's going to abandon some of its fossil fuel assets and go into the clean energy business, well, I don't feel so good about that. I mean, it's great in the sense that we don't need any more fossil fuel extraction, but when you have a model that is just, is anchored in the sense of disposability of people's, extraction over consumption, offshoring devastation becomes still a part of your work. Citing green energy, clean fuels, all of these things are, again, going to be borne by communities of color. We've seen that here in Hawaii with with sort of massive scale windmills that on their face are good, but in reality are burdening our native community here. And we see that the source of these materials are still in these economies that are depleted. And this is very intentional. We talk about advanced economies in the third world or developing countries. It's actually extractive economies or overconsumptive economies and depleted economies. And that model doesn't get dismantled if we just address this in this sort of conventional sort of way, right? We need a reparative process that helps us think differently about the economy, the base economy itself, and it guarantees that we won't repeat the same harm.
Woo. Can I comment on one of the strategic issues that are involved?
Yeah. Go for it.
Maxine, I know you're an attorney, but I don't think that this is something that can be resolved through the court system.
I agree. I absolutely agree.
Not alone.
Yeah. Well, maybe not very much, because if you think about other instances of the provision of reparations, it virtually is always associated with some form of national governmental action that's legislated by a parliament or a Congress. Even in cases where we have victims, but the culpable party is not inclined to meet the debt, there are instances where the party that is not culpable has been willing to meet the debt. And an example of this is the United States government providing funds for the families who lost loved ones in the 9/11 attacks. That was a federal government financed form of reparations. And the United States government presumably was not responsible for the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And similarly, the federal government provided some funds for the families who lost their children in the Sandy Hook, Connecticut massacre. So I think we have to make our focus congressional action or parliamentary action to the extent that other nations around the world have to be brought into account for climate damage. But in addition, even if the direct culpable parties like the corporations are not willing to pay, that doesn't mean that there's no one who should be willing to pay. And so I just wanted to say that we really do have to create a political movement that's directed at legislative bodies rather than at the courts.
Oh,
I would,
I'm so glad that we raised this. Ruth, I was just going to kick it to you. So go for it. I'll come back.
well, I was just going to add that, you know, picking up on that last sentiment, it is that political movement. It's the mobilization of the people that become mutually invested in a collective process of unlearning and relearning. You know, coming back to what you said at the beginning, Dr. Darity, about the process of land allotments. I mean, we reject the entire idea that the federal government can allot land that was never theirs in the first place. The creation of this country was built on the concept of terra nullius, that land is dead, that land is empty. And that fundamental worldview is at odds, and yet has been imposed on each of us. And when we think about also, you know, solidarity, effective solidarity between Indigenous and Black communities, we all have to believe that we deserve a right to relationship with land. We deserve a right to these reparations, and we deserve access to a clean and bountiful environment. And I deeply believe that justice for Black and immigrant communities also involves re-engaging with relationship to land for those that have never had an opportunity to do so, or those who were extracted and removed from their lands. And so thinking collectively about how to reframe the falsehoods that we've each been spoon-fed about the foundation of this country and about what is inevitable to have, you know, a global hegemony, must be fundamentally unsettled. And so,
Yeah.
you know, I'll just say it, you know, like, what does the pathway to climate reparations look like? It means dismantling white supremacy, and it means dismantling the US empire. And rebuilding it into a form that provides justice and well-being and health for everyone living on these lands and living with these lands. And that includes our plant and animal relatives. And so I think that, you know, maybe this is just because, you know, my work is as an activist, but that has to start with the people. It has to start with everyone listening on this participant call and everyone that we'll talk to after this throughout the rest of our day and next week, and our families at the Thanksgiving dinner table. Talking about truth, talking about those things that make us uncomfortable, which, you know, includes with our own histories, talking about the pains and traumas that were never our fault, but that we live, and that we manifest. Because, you know, it's not that we are approaching disaster. We have been living disaster. What we are approaching is disaster for the communities that have been privileged enough to avoid it so far. We are already in an untenable status quo. And what that fundamentally means is not making excuses for how to just adapt or mitigate the negative effects of climate change, but to address the root causes and the extractive profiteering industries that are making money on the deaths of Black and brown people. You know, something that I really get sick of is being called resilient. Like, don't pat me and my people on the back for surviving despite your every attempt to stamp us out. I would love to stop being resilient. I would just love to be well. I would love for my health to be an easy thing to achieve.
We're gonna put the word strong on that same tombstone.
Yeah.
Let them go down together.
I always say that, you know, true equality would be a situation in which Black folks could be just as mediocre as white folks.
And
Yeah.
I'll say that I wanted to tie these last two statements together by saying that we've been on this road. Kivalina versus Exxon in 2008 put us on this road. We've been in a conversation about what it means to find the spaces where harm is recognized. We have built a million things in our system that allow us to have blinders on to get through it. But this whole conversation has been about building a container to take it back. to take back the conversation at the level of the law, at the level of decisions that we make. Go ahead, Ruth, say that out loud so people know.
I just want to presence my powerful matriarch mother who argued Kivalina v. Exxon. I come from a long line of powerful Indigenous women.
So I just want to flag
lawyers.
we have been doing this work. So what we're talking about now is needing everybody, because the collective means that it will take for us to get what is necessary will require folks who don't care about the law, folks who do not care about being represented, people who have been disenfranchised to the point where they do not recognize a system that could be supportive of them, people who have been ensconced in harm, been zoned to death, been put in the sacrifice zones, so much so that the curb in the corner feel more like family than the place where you live. So I just want to flag that this is the beginning of a conversation. You will look back and wonder where you were when we started having this conversation in the public on the way to the next thing. So we have about 10 minutes left before they cut us. I think we might have no minutes left. So, okay. So the Netroots fairies have told us we have 9 minutes left. Woohoo! Just wanted to flag that. We'll see if there are any questions from the audience. And while we're waiting for that, I'll ask everyone if there's just one quick thing that you'd like the audience to walk away with about this concept. What is it? What do you want people to know?
I think that there are multiple claims for restitution that exist. Including the claim that I've been working on concerning Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. There is an additional claim that could be made by many indigenous communities in the United States for restoration of their land and increase and improve sovereignty. Whereas for Black Americans, it's primarily a case of making a material claim for full citizenship. But I think that all of these claims we can handle in our minds and in our souls simultaneously, that we do not have to view them as being in competition with one another, even if they are not the same claims. So that's the key point I want to make, is that there are varieties of ways in which justice needs to be achieved, and on many different terrains. And I'm personally very active in pursuing the case for Black American reparations, but I want to be sure that we all recognize that there are other claims that can be made, and they should be brought forward also.
Professor Burkett, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'm so 100% behind what Sandy just said. That I just want to have a moment to just have that sink in, because I think that that's really critically important. A question I've gotten, which is to say, it sort of suggests that there's zero sum and no relationship between these claims for repair, but in fact they're so intimately intertwined, and they can be very much in concert. And I want to emphasize that things that I think I've sort of alluded to, which is that this is about building. It's about trust. It's about solidarity, and it's about what's necessary, again, in the face of the changes that we're going to see with the climate. And I hope that people will come to it with that sense of possibility. For me, in every reparative approach, that guarantee of non-repetition is so critically important. And the process to be able to investigate how we got here and how we heal from it is also a benefit of reparations, right? There's a building and a healing, and an ability to withstand these massive shocks that we're experiencing, and imagine a better future, actually implement a better future. Tamari, you opened with a sort of like imagine 2030, imagine 2040, imagine 2050. These are actually futures that we might have some opportunity to shape in a meaningful way. And I think that this is the right vessel for it.
Fantastic. My mind is blown. Ruth, do you want to give people something to walk away with?
The last thing that I'll share is Tzilku Nechjidnu. Tzilku Nechjidnu. which means we are working as one in my language. We are working as one. Our liberation is tied up together. And you know, when I think about 2030, I was making jokes earlier, like, oh gosh, I start my Lamaze breathing now. Like, what are you gonna tell me about 2030? Because I'm a young person. Man, I'm 23 and I'm terrified. I would love to be living my best early 20s life, and yet I'm scared for my future children. I'm scared for my descendants. And I, as an activated youth, as a young Native woman, am prepared for the painful transition that our world is facing, that our world is demanding of us. This is gonna hurt. It's gonna unsettle a lot of people. But the place that we will achieve, the place that we will get to through this work, through working as one, is infinitely more joyful, more celebratory, more pure, more unified than anything that we'll find on the pathway to destruction we're on now. So I have hope most days. I have a lot more hope being able to gather here with each of you and share wisdom together. I'm really honored to be here and be part of these conversations, and you know, we're working as one. Let's make it happen. Got a lot of descendants and ancestors counting on us.
Well, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for bringing your whole self, as busy as you are, to this conversation. It has been an incredible opening for a discussion about challenging the status quo, about envisioning what is new, about imagining that we can and have every right to show up for what is ours, which is a collective utility for this planet, not to watch it be exchanged for things we never said we wanted. One of my favorite things that each of you has said, Professor Burkett mentioned that we can imagine another future and it's so close to us. What's been taken from us is what we have to go back and get, because we've been put in a position where we feel like all that we can have is what was painted for us by others. Dr. Darity really brought it home that the fight for reparations is tied up amongst the different groups of people, all of whom have been victimized by this same concept in unique and connected ways. Ruth really connected this long-term conversation about erasure to our current view of who stands in line for harm, who gets to be seen as people experiencing it, and what it means to have just the very separation be its own violence. I started this conversation with a discussion around the financial violence. I'm wearing a pin here that would normally go on my hair that says "pay me," because there's nothing more American than being polite and not talking about money. So I think it's an incredible time for us to start this question, kicking off the first day of Netroots. And on behalf of every single activist, rebel, rouser, and rabble rouser at 350.org, thank you. We're super excited to be in this moment together and looking forward to many more such conversations, hopefully for more than 50 minutes so we can get real gritty, but we'll work on it. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Don't stay up too late drinking. You're still at home on the internet. Thank you.
Chicken everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.